Welcome everyone to our next conversation with Louisa Moats and Michelle Hosp. Today we're going to be discussing assessment for word reading difficulties in online and hybrid environments. It's part of a series of conversations we've held with experts around addressing word reading difficulties, including dyslexia. And we're so excited to have both Louisa and Michelle with us today. I'm Monica Ng. I am the Vice President of Education Programs at Pivot Learning, and I'm joined by my colleague, Carrie.
Welcome, everybody.
Carrie is the Director of Literacy from CORE. So excited to be joined today by Dr. Moats.
I also wanted to take this opportunity to introduce our other special guest, Dr. Michelle Hosp.
All right, so our next question is, many school leaders and teachers have expressed how difficult it can be to administer reading assessments when teaching online. What effective approaches have you observed? What advice or support would you offer for teachers who are feeling overwhelmed right now?
Well, I think almost everybody is feeling overwhelmed, and that's to be acknowledged. This has been a really rough year. Nevertheless, there are things we can do to monitor where our students are and to assess their skills. First of all, this is where Michelle Hosp's work comes in. If you have a good online assessment of skills that are appropriately measured online, and if that tool has been validated and has been shown to be a reliable indicator of what kids can do, by all means, use a computer-based assessment like key phonics. I'm a big believer in key phonics, is really good. If you're measuring other things that are better addressed in other ways, primarily phoneme awareness and spelling, in my opinion, you can still give a survey of a student's abilities in phoneme awareness by having the student respond one-on-one with you as the evaluator, giving items and the student responding orally, because phoneme awareness assessments are supposed to be done orally, and it's perfectly possible to do that. And I would guess that those are quite reliable if the student is paying attention and is in a quiet context where they can hear and pay attention to what the evaluator is doing. So that can be done with any of the good screeners for phoneme awareness, like Dave Kilpatrick's, and there are others out there. And then as far as spelling goes, which I think should be part of any assessment of sub-skills in reading, that's a tough one, because it's better to have kids write words that are dictated to them than look at a computer screen and identify the correct spelling out of a number of choices, for example. That's because we want to see what kinds of errors kids are making if they don't know how to spell the word, and interpret them from a linguistic perspective if possible. And we also want to just know if they can write and engage in the manual activity of writing, which is very important, as important as learning the keyboard, especially in the first few years of schooling. But I think that in addition to phonics, you can get a reliable assessment of oral reading fluency over the computer. If the student has the student pages to read from, you as the evaluator can still give 1-minute time samples of passage reading on a measure like Acadience reading, and get a pretty reliable result.
People are overwhelmed, and it is really hard to do things remotely. I think one of the things that is still really important, and Louisa touched on this, is that we still need data and we need to be thoughtful. Because it's harder now than ever before, we actually need to be more thoughtful about the data that we're collecting. If we don't have a specific question and something that we're trying to find an answer to, then we should really be spending our time teaching. If, however, we really have questions about a student's reading skills, what particular patterns they're struggling with, then that is when we need to be collecting data. I think we need to be understanding that sometimes we don't need a ton of data on everyone, but we really need to understand who we need data on, and we need to be thoughtful about using assessments that we can actually get good information. So we'll talk, I think, later about computer adaptive assessments, but it is really important to be able to actually have a student produce something instead of just respond to something, because production is a much harder skill. And so when we think about assessments, particularly in reading, we actually want to hear the student read. Otherwise, it becomes very difficult. So, doing those online, it's still important, and finding, like Louisa touched on, finding, quiet spaces and places where that can be done thoughtfully is something that we should still be striving for, just like we would if we were in the classroom.
Online assessments have become increasingly popular, and now, of course, because of remote teaching, they're more and more necessary. So, and often these assessments are computer adaptive. And so, what useful information can these assessments provide, and what are some of the perils of using computer adaptive assessment for screening and progress monitoring and reading?
Well, the better ones probably can give you a pretty good estimate of a student's relative standing, and they may even give you a pretty reliable indicator of whether the student is at risk or not, and the degree to which the student may be behind expectation for that grade level. However, the drawback is that a computer adapted assessment doesn't usually give you enough information. It doesn't thoroughly survey knowledge across a domain of skill. It only briefly samples each domain subcomponent of reading to issue that sort of composite picture of where the student stands overall. And it may even say, well, the student is relatively weak in phoneme awareness, but still you have no idea what that means in terms of where to go next with instruction. So you're still in the position of having to use comprehensive surveys that sample across a skill domain through a logical scope and sequence to see where you need to plug in for instruction.
I think there are some perks for computer adaptive assessments. I think the biggest one is that you can have multiple students being assessed at the same time. So because a lot of the times, if it's done in a school, they can do it in a computer lab where all the kids are logging in. If it's done at home, they can, do it on their own time or at a certain specified time. They often test a wide variety of skills. So, they really do sample a domain. So you get a little glimpse, a little sample of how they do across many different features. Like for reading, it might have some phonemic awareness tasks, some phonics tasks, some fluency, vocabulary, comprehension, those types of tasks built in. And most of them are adaptive. So that means that the students only get questions depending on how they responded to the last question. So if the question is too difficult, then it tests down to try to understand what skills the student has. And if the question is answered correctly, then they keep testing up. So those are some of the things that are nice about computer adaptive assessments, because it really does adapt to the student's skills. However, I think there are also lots of perils. And so I think some of it, particularly for screening and progress monitoring, it's not a direct measure. So the student actually is only responding to something. They actually don't ever have to read or produce something. So it's really hard to understand what is good guesswork versus what skill can the student actually that they have and they can demonstrate. The other thing is the teacher often misses out on those formative assessments. So teachers are really good at tuning into their kids. And when you're testing a kid, that's part of what you're doing. You're really listening and thinking about what they're doing. And it also gives you an opportunity on the spot to dig deeper with them. If they're making an error, you can go back and ask them a question and you can try to clarify some of those errors they're making. So you really are getting a lot more information when it's one-on-one. The other thing is, if the teacher is not part of the assessment process, then they often really don't even understand what the student was tested on, because they don't know, because it is adaptive. They don't know what questions the kid attempted, which ones they got right, which ones they got wrong. Sometimes they get these reports, which are often convoluted to understand. Sometimes they're even hard to find in the system. I've asked teachers, I've observed some of these assessments, and when I ask them, so what is it that this student is working on or needs? The teacher's like, I don't know, I have to go find that report. So there's really kind of a big gap between what the kid's being tested on and what the student and what the teacher actually has, the information they have quickly about understanding how they can help the kid. Some of the other things is some of these assessments are really long. They take 30 to 60 minutes. That's a long time to test a kid, and often not necessary, depending on the question, because it often doesn't give you really good information about what to teach. So it just gives you a general understanding of skills. And then the other thing is, because students might be answering different questions, for progress monitoring, we really want the assessment to be stable, meaning we want the student to be actually responding to the same level of difficulty on the test each time they're given that test. And with adaptive assessments, it changes. So we actually don't know, is it the test or is it the student that's improving? So that's another difficult thing as well. And I think the biggest thing is that they really don't lend themselves to understanding really specific skill issues. So in order to understand, if your question is about, does the student know specific phonics skills? Those assessments typically are not going to give you that information. You're much better off giving something like key phonics or the core phonics inventory, something that actually measures specific phonics skills, so you can use that information to go on and teach. The other thing is, for computer adaptive assessments, I've talked to lots of colleagues about this, and I kind of feel, particularly for kids who struggle the most, I don't feel like it's super reliable, because I think of those kids as Swiss cheese, right? We have what we think of as a logical scope and sequence of skills that kids need. But our kids who tend to struggle the most, like sometimes they really have this skill up here, but they're missing some skills down here. And you don't really get that understanding with a computer adaptive assessment, because the assumption is if they got this question right, they would have gotten everything underneath it correctly as well. That's not always the case for kids who struggle. They often have skills that they're missing. And so you're making these assumptions that the kid's okay, and you've never actually assessed them on the skill. So you really don't know if they are okay. The other thing I would mention is that they often tend to be pretty expensive. And I think school districts might think about how they might use those funds for things that might be more helpful, like, really robust and evidence-based interventions and professional development for teachers and things that actually might have a better impact.
All right, so our next question is, why do we time tasks in reading assessments? What additional information do timed tasks provide?
So the reason why reading assessments are timed is it actually allows us to determine much better about how good the student is at reading, how automatic and fluent they are at reading, because that automaticity is the indication of their overall reading skills. The more fluent they are in automatic, actually, there's lots of studies that show they actually do better on comprehension questions, their vocabulary is better, they have stronger phonics skills, phonemic awareness skills. So all of those things actually tie in together. And if you think about it, I often challenge people that in order to be proficient at anything, you have to demonstrate two things. You have to demonstrate accuracy, and you also have to do it within a certain rate or time frame. And this applies to anything. I don't think there's anything that you can do or be an expert at that those two things, accuracy and appropriate rate, don't apply to. So example, if I'm cooking, right? If I have a restaurant, my accuracy is that that my dishes taste the same, hopefully good, each time I make them. The fluency is that I actually get it to your table in an appropriate amount of time. Either one of those falter, and I'm not really considered a proficient restaurant owner. Same thing is if I'm playing an instrument, right? I have to accurately hit the notes, and I have to have the right tempo, the right rate and pace. If either one of those falter, I'm not good at my instrument. So the same applies for reading. I actually have to be accurate in reading the words, and I have to produce them at a particular rate in order to be fluent. And I think about when people think that, rate and fluency is taboo, then they're not really understanding how important it is for kids reading. And if you only look at accuracy, teachers are like, all I care about is that the kid is accurate. And I say, okay, so if you have one student and you give them a list of 50 words, they're 100% accurate. And they read that list in 1 minute. So that's just a little bit over a second per word. You have a second student, you give them the same 50 words, and it takes them 5 minutes to read that list. They're 100% accurate. Both students are 100% accurate. One student took about 1 second, the other student took about 6 seconds. Not the same reader, not the same skill level. So it really does give you another indication of actually how proficient the student is. So both of those things really matter, and you have to have rate included in that.
I think one of the things that we know, Michelle, about dyslexia is fluency is often an issue. So that automaticity, that many students can work really hard to decode a word, but it's very laborious and it takes a lot of effort in order for them to do that. And so is there anything that we should think about in terms of time tasks and students and trying to identify students with dyslexia or support students with dyslexia?
Yeah, so we actually do know that rate is one of those indicators, right? That if we look at rapid automatic naming, so it doesn't even need to be words, it could be objects, it could be colors, it could be pictures. We actually do know that there is a correlation between students who have a difficulty rapidly naming something and dyslexia. So that doesn't mean that we teach them to be fast at naming colors and then their reading problem is solved. But it does mean that that is an indication. And if we know that students take longer, then what that means is that our instruction needs to be more intense. It needs to be more systematic. The students need to be really given a lot of corrective feedback if they're making mistakes. Every time a student makes mistakes, there's, the synapses are firing, and it actually makes it harder to break that, hardwire and get them to learn it right. So immediate corrective feedback is really critical. And then tons of practice. These kids actually need more time, more practice, more instruction. They need more of everything. And then they don't outgrow it, right? But they learn to adapt, and they learn to have the skills to be more proficient and more automatic.
So our mission at Pivot and Core is to partner with educators to design and implement solutions to their greatest challenges in achieving educational justice. And so, as you can tell from these conversations, we're deeply committed to improving teaching and learning for students. And both of our organizations have 20 years of expertise working with districts and schools to support systems, to support delivering curriculum implementation and services aligned to high quality English language arts and math instructional materials.